And just like magic, we've appeared on stage. So, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to, I guess, is now the traditional Sunday lunchtime JAEFF panel discussion, kindly sponsored by the Japan Foundation. Welcome to the first day of autumn, it seems, as well. Thank you for battling the storms, the car-free day to be here. So we've got several events later today. I hope you're coming to some of the screenings. We have Pigs and Battleships showing on a 35mm print after this panel event, and our closing night film is Nagisa Ōshima's stunning Death by Hanging. And there are a few tickets left at the box office, so if you haven't got them yet, do snatch those up before the hordes descend later on. So it's great to be chairing this event again, and I'm very honored to be sharing the stage with an extremely esteemed lineup of guests. To my right, I've got Damian Flanagan. Damian has written several books in English and Japanese on Japanese literature, including the Critical Lives biography of Yukio Mishima, which I highly recommend. Isolde Standish, I'm going from left to right here. Isolde Standish, back from JAEFF 2018. She's a freelance writer and emeritus reader in film and media at SOAS. She's currently working on a book-length study of Nagisa Ōshima. And Lola Martinez is an emeritus reader in anthropology with special reference to Japan at SOAS and a research affiliate at ISCA, University of Oxford. Her current research is on the anthropology of the imagination, particularly in relation to imaginaries of the future. And Lola was, in fact, Isolde's PhD supervisor. So we'll be aiming to exploit any underlying residual tensions from that previous relationship over the course of the next hour and a half. And Alejandra Armendáriz-Hernández is a PhD candidate at the University Rey Juan Carlos in Madrid, writing a dissertation on female authorship and representation in the films directed by Tanaka Kinuyo. She works at the Japan Society in London and is currently a visiting researcher at Birkbeck University. Now, I've loosely structured this event around some key points, so I will be skippering the good ship JAEFF around the choppy waters of these. They will not be hazardous to anyone in the room, but we'll begin by outlining and talking about the political and cultural mainstream in Japan from the years coming after the Second World War, moving then into a discussion of the cinema of the 1960s and 70s, the kind of films we've been showing at JAEFF, and how that was possibly a reaction against this time. And then moving ever forward in time to the present day to think about how politics and culture are relating to art at the moment in Japan, and perhaps how these things may connect to us in the West and in the UK as well. And I'm aiming to have this panel finished by 3:10, in deference to those who are watching Pigs and Battleships afterwards, as the turnaround is quite tight. So I think with that in mind, we better move ahead. So I wonder if together as a panel, we can sketch out some of these main political ideologies in post-war Japan, and how these did develop through the 1950s or through the late 40s into the 50s, and then moving into the 60s. And if Lola, I could ask on you to begin, and then Isolde, Alejandra, and Damian, you can chip on. It should be working, I think.
It should be working. Oh,
it
you
sounds
can hear
great,
me.
yes.
Right. Well, the 40s and 50s were interesting because you had this moment in which the left, the communists from the pre-war era, were suddenly heroic because they'd stood against the war. And so they gained a certain amount of political power through to about 1955 when the Liberal Democrats, became very big and ruled the country as the Conservative Party, despite their title for a long time. But they also took over the studios in terms of ideology. So Kurosawa famously complained that he had been censored by the Japanese government, by the American military, and then by the communist scriptwriters wanting things to be more ideologically political and right on. So they had a great deal of power for quite some time. But as with everything in any society, but in Japan perhaps in particular, you began to see splinters. So you get young people coming up who begin to form the avant-garde and are interested in the new wave in France, who break away from the old left that they begin to think are being too conservative in their politics. And they become known as the new left. And they're the people who go on in through the 60s when we begin to see a lot of kind of radical student politics going on. And that's just very sketchy. I don't know if anybody wants to drop in and say anything more about that. But I think that's kind of the situation of the left. At the same time, we mustn't forget that studios were still making the sorts of films they'd always made. You know, samurai drama, Yakuza films, family drama, comedies in the 60s, beach party films, you know. So that kind of political ideology only held sway with, we might say, a small but very important group of young people.
Should I chime in at this point?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think one of the things to think about by the time you get to the 1960s and the directors that were coming through at that time, and here I'm thinking very much of Ōshima, Imamura Shohei, and Yoshida, Hanisusumu, people like that, the very people that that are making the films that you're viewing at the moment, that these were the first generation of post-war film directors. You know, they were born around the 1930s. So they had a certain experience of the war, they had an experience of the post-defeat era and the extreme hardships growing up in that time. And I think that had a profound impact. Also, many of them they were at university in the 50s. And during that time, there was a great deal of upheaval politically against what was happening within the universities. And I think for many of this generation, this certainly comes through in Ōshima Nagisa's writings, was a total distancing from the left completely. I mean, they disliked the left of politics as much as the right. And this is one of the reasons why in my book, Politics, Porn and Protest, I talk about a dissentient group as opposed to a leftist group or a right-wing group. And I think Ōshima's film from 1960, Night and Fog in Japan, is a wonderful example, if in a sense, of the ambiguity of their political position, because that film is completely against the Communist Party and what we would call the hard left. And it was interesting because if you read the reviews of the film from the 1960s when it was first screened, I mean, remember, it was only screened for 4 days because it was pulled by the studios, and there was, it was believed that it was actually through the Prime Minister's office that they contacted the head of the studio and asked them to remove it from screens. So you've got the right, the LDP by this time, as Lola was saying, they've been entrenched in the government. And so you've got the LDP putting pressure on the studio to pull the film. But equally, the reviews in the Communist Party, the Red Flag, Akahata, they were equally as scathing of the film. So, you know, the film was being castigated by both the left and the right. And I think in many ways that sort of is emblematic of what was happening with these particular filmmakers at that time. The other thing I think that's important to remember too, and Lola touched on this with the idea of the French Nouvelle Vague, but it wasn't only the French. I mean, Ōshima in his writings, for instance, was very much influenced by Polish filmmakers, in particular Andrzej Wada. And he cites, I think it was 1956, Andrzej Wada's film Ashes and Diamonds as an influence. And again, I think there's this link between European filmmakers and Japanese filmmakers, linked again to this sense of a sort of generational consciousness as this first generation of post-war filmmakers. And I think it's right, I think Lola said somewhere that it's not a case of imitation, but it's a case of transcultural influences.
And we mustn't forget there was also an anti-American movement among these young
Oh,
filmmakers,
definitely,
which
yeah.
is why the European influence becomes so powerful and important.
Yes, that's absolutely right.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add maybe that, of course, these filmmakers started doing films at the end of the 50s, and but before, in the 40s and the 50s, there were a generation who has actually started doing films pre-war, and he was working during the wartime. Some of them were to the front, like Ozu Yasujiro was in Singapore. Most of the filmmakers have to do propaganda films, because from 1939, the cinema became part of the propaganda system in Japan, and everything was focused on the idea of the total war. So the idea that everyone has to put all the efforts, including filmmakers, including film industry. Film industry got rearranged and focused in 3 studios. So after the war, there was this period with the American or Allied occupation, and it was a kind of a change of ideology, but it was still the same system of censorship, because before was imperial censorship, of Japanese fascist censorship, and rules and control, and during the occupation was the American one. So some filmmakers find themselves one day doing propaganda films from hailing the emperor, and the day after, or the month after, or the year after, doing the same for spreading the American democracy values. Those filmmakers, of course, they have also the issue of the question of their own war responsibility. That was happening particularly at the first period of the occupation, in which clearly most of them, I mean, I will say everyone, yeah, even the common people welcomed the end of the war, because it was a very difficult situation. So filmmakers, after the end of the war, they were happy to have like a freedom of expression, some ways, under the and another type of values, democratic. They were in some ways full of hopes that things will change. And for a brief period of time, even if they were under the American occupation rules, they have some hopes of change. That changed a little bit at the end of the occupation, where there was, they call it the reverse course of the American Allied forces, in which they became totally anti-communist. So that implies that all the communist and left filmmakers within the studio were purged. There were, it's famous, the Toho strikes, in which the union were actually suppressed with the help of the American military army. So those filmmakers went independent. So there was a kind of a frustration after all the promises of democracy that didn't actually became real. Other filmmakers, they have been doing like the famous classics, Ozu, Mizoguchi, Naruse, and also like the Star System, who was a kind of continuity between pre-war and post-war. They clearly have, they entered in some ways in the idea of the war was a question of the military elite who manipulate the people. So the responsible were the military and the government, but the common people was just victims, and so filmmakers were in some ways also part of this general consciousness of, okay, we were just following orders, so now we have to reconvert and become democratic, but we don't, they were not forced to, by the American occupation, to reflect on their own responsibility as filmmakers. There were some of them who try, and of course, some of them have, you can see in the films that there is this undercurrent, but still they were part of the general population thinking, and okay, we want to forget the past, we want to start a new era, and it was in this moment that all masters and part of the film industry, not all of them of course, but part of the film industry came out with this post-war humanism cinema, in which the center was the human being scratched by the powerful or by the war, or in any case more on the victim side than on the reflection of the actual war responsibility.
Well, I think you see an ambiguity, and I think that's an important point to take away from this whole discussion, because someone like Kurosawa, who didn't like the Americans, he thought the Japanese could figure out how to be democratic on their own, who felt guilty about the war, and I think you see that in his films. Ōshima felt he wasn't radical enough, and he even wrote an essay about saying, you know, how disappointed he was. Although Donald Ritchie notes that at the end of his life, Ōshima kind of was still calling Kurosawa master. So that kind of relationship mended itself somehow. But yes, it was kind of, everybody was taking positions and shifting, and it was a very interesting time, we might say.
These shifting ideologies reminds me of Damian, in your introduction on Friday for Mishima: Life in 4 Chapters, you spoke about 1945 being an avant-garde moment in Japan. If you could expand on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that really interests me about watching the avant-garde films of the 60s and 70s is that they contain within them, I think, all a deep wrestling with the trauma of the Second World War. And this, I think, was kind of buried at first, because when there's a complete paradigm shift at the end of the war, and obviously the fact that the war's ended, that liberal values have come in, this is liberating and welcome, and certain aspects of censorship are lifted, so that particularly the ability to write about certain sexual themes, which people find very liberating. And there's obviously a concentration on getting the country economically back on its feet. So for quite a long time, these are the senses that this is a wonderful new start that you're making and that you're proceeding with, and particularly as you go through the 50s and economic growth starts to pick up. But I think once you get to a certain level into the 60s, you've now got beyond that period of worrying about starvation and black markets and everything else. And what then it becomes that what has happened in that tremendous shift, that trauma that's happened in 1945, that there's been all those terrible years of war, that all those millions and millions of people have died. What was that all about? That can't simply be brushed away and said that, hey folks, we're now a democracy, everything's sunny and bright. And you probably know they had this, the tribe of the sun, at the end of the 50s, these bright new things, and everything sort of picking up on the American films of the time, that everything was like Marilyn Monroe and James Dean. But there's like, what was that all about? That just so recently there was such misery, such sacrifice, such death. And I think that is a huge trauma in the psyche of Japan. And that all the figures who come of age in the 60s have to, in their own way, try to reassess that and think that, well, what actually is this country that we're living in? Is it all just about commercialism? Are we just supposed to be satisfied with the fact that now everyone can get a television and a fridge? And is this what Japan actually is? So, and I think at the same time as that deep trauma starts to come to the surface, Japan is also hit then by all the other things which are going on in the 1960s. There's the Cultural Revolution going on in China, which seems like, is this country perhaps going to have a cultural revolution? Could that happen here? There's the increasing Vietnam War and America's increasing involvement in that. There's the settlement which had been agreed with America, the security treaty. People think, well, why is this something that it's our destiny to be completely involved in? So there's all these worldwide trends going on which are coming into Japan and interconnecting with these deep-seated traumas about what was the meaning, the cause of this terrible events which have happened so recently in our nation's history. And I think that also on a kind of philosophical level, the people are reading a lot of European philosophers like Sartre and Georges Bataille and people like that, and they're thinking about, well, what does this actually tell us about the nature of truth, about the nature of how we perceive society itself? So I think all these things are kind of like a cocktail of influences, deep trauma of history, stimulating new philosophical currents, and a volatile international situation that produce in this new wave of directors some extremely interesting work about what is the actual nature of the society we're living in and what is the place of the individual within it.
If anyone was at Close-Up Cinema last night, you would have seen me in Sun Tribe fancy dress. There'll be some pictures online or something. That's not what we're here for. So, Isolde, I was just going back to what you said about how this sort of the left becomes something that isn't left enough, and then are these?
Well, it's not so much it isn't left enough. I mean, it's a disillusionment with the Communist Party. I mean, in '56 you have was it Khrushchev denouncing Stalin. Well, that really caused problems within the Japanese Communist Party. This is the mainstream Communist Party. And then, of course, that was then contradicted when, the Russians went into Hungary. So within the Communist Party, there were all these sort of contentions going on. And you see, it was interesting in the case of Ōshima because his father was a Marxist. But yet Ōshima quite clearly denounces this in his own writings. So, there was a sense that the left, in terms of the official Communist Party, had kind of let them down. And with the sort of conservatism of the LDP, and particularly with, as Damian was pointing out, the renewal of the alliance, the security treaty with America, what was known as the AMPO struggle, and the way that was forced through the parliament, through the Diet, meant that there was a huge disillusionment with the right. So, I mean, where do you place yourself? The other thing, and again, this was a point I think Damian's mentioned, was the idea of consumerism. Yep. I mean, consumerism was the big sort of payoff, because when the AMPO struggle failed and the treaty was renewed with America, the Prime Minister, Kishi Nobusuke, had to resign, the then Prime Minister. But the next Prime Minister that came in, Hayashi, was it Hayashi? I've forgotten. Anyway, he immediately announced an income doubling policy. And this meant that, by and large, the students who had been protesting against the security treaty and who had, up to a certain point, incorporated a lot of ordinary people into the struggle, well, these people sort of fell away, so the students were again left fairly isolated in this struggle. So there's this kind of trade-off where ordinary people said, okay, we want the fridge, we want the television, we want the three treasures, which were the television, the vacuum cleaner and the refrigerator, I think. And eventually it became the car. But equally, I mean, somebody like Ōshima, he got involved, he went to Korea fairly early on. As soon as Japanese people were issued with passports, he went over to Korea. And he saw for himself the devastation that the Korean War had caused. Well, of course, we've got to remember that Japan's economic recovery was really built on the Korean War. the then Prime Minister Yoshida Shigeru said, you know, thank God for the Korean War, because that was the starting of Japan's economic recovery. So here you've got the sort of Japanese consumerism, the three treasures and everything, being built on the misery of another Asian country who's been subjected to the very sort of war that Japan had been through. So, you know, where do you put yourself ideologically in those circumstances?
Well, are the terms left-wing and right-wing as we use them and understand them in the West? I know that might be itself becoming somewhat blurred, but is it potentially oversimplistic or reductive to transplant those terms onto Japan? Or was there such an effect of the American occupation after the war?
They did use the term the new left as opposed to the old left in Japan. So it's not that but we shouldn't apply all the concepts that maybe we would in the West to that, to those categories that we might see in those categories. In some ways they were more fluid, they were anti-more and different things. I mean, I think Japan, interestingly enough, was worried about the USSR before British communists were, you know, for a long time. It took a long time to sink in the UK that perhaps, you know, among British Marxists, that perhaps this was not a good thing, what was going on. And the Japanese new left in particular, as Isolde was saying, reacted very quickly. So much more on top of the political world in some ways. And certainly they were part, as Damian was saying, in '68, all the anti-Vietnam War protests were going on in Japan as well. They were perfectly aware of what the theater in the Pacific looked like politically and what the problems were. And I'm not sure all of those students would have called themselves new left or old left, or they just were protesting against this situation. And I was thinking about this day before yesterday, because one of the outcomes of that, well, two things. One of the outcomes is that there's a law against more than 2,000 people gathering for political reasons in Japan publicly. So when you look at the climate change protests, there were probably groups of 2,000 people dotted all over Tokyo, but they couldn't all be together because that's illegal. But that's a result of '68. Yeah, it's still. So the news can report. There wasn't much of a protest against that because only 2,000 people showed up at the American embassy or whatever. But if you talk to radicals, they would say, well, actually, we were all over the city in groups of 2,000. So that's an interesting outcome. And the other interesting outcome, I've now forgotten what it was going to be.
Can I just say as well, just because there's the differences between the people on the left, but just to talk about the right, it's interesting that Mishima is obviously regarded as a sort of classic right-wing figure, but you might not know that originally, I mean, Mishima for most of his career was apolitical. He only becomes politicized in the last few years of his life. But one of the things I really love about the 1960s is the dialogue that goes on between artists on both what are called the right and the left. Mishima was engaging in tie-down conversations with Ōshima, very interested in a lot of work that people in the left were doing. And if you go back to 1960, ironically, Mishima got into a lot of trouble. In fact, this was one of the events that actually started his process of politicization. There was a story called An Elegant Dream, which was written by a left-leaning writer, which very provocatively talked about the entire imperial family being killed in an uprising. And when Mishima heard that this was being published, he was supposed to have suggested. Mishima was never, ever against suppressing any of these things. He was always a passionate believer in freedom of speech. And he suggested that it might be a good idea to run that story in the same edition of the magazine that the story Patriotism, but the original story of which the film we saw the other night was based on. And this would kind of like balance things out so that there'd be something for the right and the left. This then, once there was outrage about this story from the right, ironically, Mishima copped the blame for it, that he was supposed to have suggested that they ran this story. And then Mishima got death threats from the right wing in Japan. And there were several months when Mishima had to have a police escort and was supposed to have carried a gun or something like that because he was worried about being assassinated by the right in Japan. And Mishima always had this not very harmonious relationship at all with the right in Japan, because he was a very imaginative thinker, and his ideas about what the role of the emperor was in Japan was at odds with the straightforward, unimaginative right wing who just wanted to defend all Japan's historical actions. Mishima was actually a strong critic of the Showa Emperor Hirohito, and he allowed his imagination to start talking about the Solan Emperor. This is picking up on ideas of Heidegger, of thinking about what the emperor should be, this ideal form of the emperor, what that represented in Japanese society. And he saw the emperor not in those sort of historical terms, but in a much more spiritual sense, as he referred to the emperor as a kind of something that would be a central balancing force in society. He's seeing in the 60s the way that society is seesawing back and forth between all these different forces of right and left, and that to kind of hold some sense of continuity, the emperor could provide that role. He could also speak to a Japan that rose up above this sort of bland consumerism, that offered that Japan was something more than that. And he saw the emperor as a communicator, like a shamanistic figure, also speaking to the dead, the vast numbers who died in the previous war. So I don't think we should at all think of Japanese as history in this period as a straight left and right. I think there's enormous complexities between particularly what the artists of the period, the ideas they pick up, and I think they're creating sort of new ideas which hadn't really existed before, and doing some really creative things with them, both mixing contemporary European thoughts with some very, very deep-rooted ideas in Japanese society to create some really fascinating new ideas.
I remembered my second point, which was to pick up Isolde and consumerism, which you also talked about. When the sociologist Ellis Krauss went back to talk to the people he'd done sit-ins with in '68 when he was doing sociology at Tokyo University, he found that they'd all settled into being middle-class Japanese, no longer radicals. So,
well, there must be quite a lot of middle-aged, late middle-aged people in Japan who are at those protests, and do they recognize their past, or is it all sort of brushed under the carpet now?
I think that happens with any generation, doesn't it? I mean, I was at school during the Vietnam War in Australia, and there were all the moratorium protests there, etc. And I mean, most of the people that were in those eventually conformed, and you get to a certain age, don't you, with a mortgage. And
but one of your PhD students has written very nicely about how this generation blamed that generation for knuckling under.
And also you have the idea of the generation who grows up in the post-war that are profoundly pacifist, and they are now fighting. There is a big chunk of the population right now fighting against the change in the Constitution. Yes. And those people, you have very young students movement rising up again, but also you have all this generation who was born after the war or who experienced the end of the war but didn't fight, and they have this profound Pacific, a type of Japanese pacifism they are like now defending on the streets against the government and the nationalists, like trying to rewrite the past or change the Constitution. So this generation, the post-war generation, is still influencing today, even if, of course, they are decreasing. But
I'm just reversing back to this idea of Mishima as this avant-garde, albeit a very popular avant-garde figure who doesn't fit easily into boxes. And of course, patriotism was distributed by the Art Theatre Guild, the ATG. So I wonder if we can expand that in a more wider sense to think about the avant-garde cinema in the 60s. And is it something that can't really be put into boxes in that same way? Is it something that perhaps in an avant-garde sense aims more to provoke than to sit within an ideology? Isolde, I'm asking.
Well, I think really to understand the avant-garde and the independent films of this period, you have to sort of look at the way the industry was changing in Japan. I mean, the major studios were in decline at this point. I think their highest box office taking was in 1958, and there was a sort of gradual decline after that. And the Art Theatre Guild was set up largely under the influence of Kawakita Kashiko, who had actually worked with her husband, Kawakita Nagamasa, to promote, well, their original intention was to promote Japanese films abroad in Europe, and this was happening, you know, before the war. During the war period, of course, they got involved with the German government because of the political connections and were instrumental in making the co-production with the German director Funk, The Samurai's Daughter, with the Japanese filmmaker Itami Mansaku. Anyway, after the war, Kawakita Kashiko wanted to continue this idea of promoting Japanese films abroad, but she'd also travelled extensively in Europe and was keen to introduce the idea of the European art house cinema into Japan. So she was instrumental in setting up the Art Theatre Guild as a cinema. Well, actually it became a cinema chain, several cinemas, specifically with the aim of showing European art house cinema. So it was part of a kind of educational project to sort of wean Japanese audiences off the sort of Hollywood fare. I mean, she was particularly annoyed with films like Ben-Hur, which were incredibly popular in Japan at the time. So it was interesting because the first film that the Art Theatre Guild screened in their main cinema was the Polish film Mother Joan of the Angels, which is an incredibly difficult film, you know, for anyone to understand, I think, let alone a Japanese audience at that time, because it was based on the French story The Devils of Loudun, you know, about a group of nuns who get possessed by the devil in the 16th century or something. Anyway, that was the kind of film she was aiming at. And you see, this was actually targeted very much at this new, educated, young audience, because you get this sort of huge numbers of students going to university, so you've got this, in a sense, these young, educated youth looking for something different and looking for an alternative to American culture. But what was interesting is Art Theatre Guild was actually funded by one of the Japanese big studios, because they actually recognized that this was a new trend. So there was an economic policy kind of built into it. But it was so successful that eventually they started co-producing films. And this, in a sense, was the beginning of giving actual filmmakers artistic freedom. Because, I mean, obviously, cinema is always caught between the ideas, I mean, is it art or is it an industry? And obviously on the industry side, there's far less artistic freedom very often than if you think of it as an art form. And the idea of the Art Theatre Guild was to sort of veer towards the artistic side. So filmmakers were given financial support, but there were no restrictions. I mean, the only condition was that the film would be screened in their cinemas. The other factor that sort of influenced from an industry point of view at this time is, as box office numbers were declining in the big studios, because we've got to remember Japan had a vertically integrated system, so the studios produced the films, they distributed them, and they showed them in their own cinema chains. Well, obviously, as audiences were in decline, their profits began to drop. So they started to produce fewer films, but yet they still had these big cinema chains. So they still had to find films for them. And again, this was an opening for independent filmmakers, because obviously under the old vertically integrated system, there was no way if you'd made a film as an independent filmmaker, you could probably get it screened anywhere. So it's these kind of factors within the industry that allowed for a sort of opening. The other point, as Damian said, under the post-war period and these sort of slightly convoluted sense of sexual representation becoming slightly more open, you get the rise of the pink film too, which again, the sort of softcore pornography, which again allowed for a certain amount of independent films to be made. And there became this kind of overlap then between a lot of sort of art house cinema and softcore pornography.
Well, I'd love to dwell on that, but we've mentioned European cinema being part of the start of the ATG cinemas, and we mentioned a while back the influence of the French New Wave. And it's a question for Lola, really, because in your work you challenge this notion of Japan being, quote, a nation who copies. And I wonder, do we need to be a bit careful comparing this period in the 60s to, say, the French New Wave? Is there something actually, do we need to focus on what makes these films very Japanese, what specific to Japanese culture?
Well, I mean, two things there, and back to Isolde's point about cinema being an industry as well as an art, and I think it's as well as rather than or, which is that as an industry, the need to make money means that copying goes on all the time, and remakes and franchises, and I mean, this goes on in every part of the global cinema world. So I always think it's wrong to just look at Japan and say, oh, Japan copies. Secondly, when I was doing my Kurosawa book and talking to film directors about their relationship to Kurosawa, it's very clear, and I know this from ethnographic film directors, which I'm very involved with as well. Directors watch everything. They're watching film all the time, any film they can get their hands on. They're always asking, how was that done? Does that work? Do I like that camera angle? What sound equipment was, judging a film festival, I don't know if it happens to you, I sit with a filmmaker, and we're saying entirely different things. We always come to the same end, but they're saying wrong lighting, why did they do that edit? And I'm going, the story isn't flowing, right? So film directors all over the world watch and learn from other film directors. They watch and learn from being in the soft porn industry. A lot of young Japanese film directors now have their roots there. And so they're constantly taking this material and reassembling it. It's a term I think is very important. Reassembling it in a way that speaks to their situation. And I think this happens to any film director anywhere. But in Japan, yes, things get reassembled in a way that is particularly Japanese. And I do love Furuhata's book on cinema of reality about some of the avant-garde filmmakers, because it really shows how their filmmaking was an intellectual process of reassembling things to make sense for Japan and their politics. And just a final note, as an anthropologist, I have to say, saying that people copy is one way that Westerners have long claimed superiority over other groups of people by saying, they're uncivilized, they don't know how to be in the world, so they copy us. So, let's get away from that term copying. But yes, filmmakers are constantly looking for inspiration and reusing ideas.
Thank you. And Alejandra, because in your work you're sort of looking for connections between Japanese cinema and Latin American cinema. And I wondered if that was a deliberate attempt to actually shift things away from the usual comparisons between the European art house and not saying that everything exists in a vacuum, but looking for connections that haven't previously been highlighted.
Yeah, I think that in the context, particularly of the Cold War politics, you have clearly the relationship between Japan and other part of Asia. You have, as they were, Isolde and Lola were mentioned, the Cultural Revolution in China. You have the Vietnam War in Vietnam, but you also have the Cuban Revolution, and you have also the situation of Latin American countries that in some ways is, even with all the differences between Japan and Latin American countries, in some ways they have a similar relationship with Anglo-European or American and European imperialism, because we thought usually Japan in terms of East and West, but when we thought about West, we usually think about United States and Europe. Technically, Latin America is also West, but is often placed in another different relationship between North and South. So they have a position that is similar to Japan in relationship, particularly in the context of post-Cold War politics and the 60s and 70s, similar relationship with the US. And there are some, I don't think that, because clearly the difference in geography, that is, they are very apart, Japan and Latin America, but you have this episode and this fragmented history of relationships, and the idea of these transcultural flows going around, and you have Japanese filmmakers going to Latin America and filming the Cuban Revolution, as Kuroki Katsuo in the La Novia de Cuba, the Cuba's girlfriend. He went there and filmed his idea of Cuban Revolution as a romantic story between a female revolutionaries in Cuba and a Japanese sailor, clearly showing Japan and showing all the issues with the disillusion of the left in Japan, and seeing Cuba as the triumph of the revolution that could happen in Japan but didn't. You have other filmmakers like Yoshida Kiyu traveling around Mexico, but at the same time you also have the part of the industrial connection between Japan and Latin America, like samurai films, for example, were very popular in Cuba and other parts of Latin America. They didn't consider those films like Japanese, but they were very popular and consumed in other parts. And you have also the Nikkei community in Latin America, like consuming Japanese films. And on the political side, again, you have the third cinema rising up in Latin America and looking at Japanese documentarists, filmmakers like Ogawa as inspiration. And you have in Cuba the new Institute of Cinematography, looking at how Japanese cinema as national cinema were winning prizes in festival and trying to imitate those achievements in Cuban cinema as well. So you have many relationships between Cuba and Latin American countries in Japan that are often or less known, because clearly there is not a progressive or a strong connection between the two. But in that particular moment in the Cold War politics, I think that there is very interesting things going on between these two parts of the world.
Moving us ahead into the present day, in fact. And we programmed this festival around the theme of nation because we felt it was important to look at cultural identity and what it means in what seems to be a period of global upheaval. And Lola, I think, are we seeing the same nationalist surge in Japan? Is it going on similar grounds as we see in North America and in Europe? I must just say at this point how delighted JAEFF is to be a part of the Japan-UK season of culture negotiated between Shinzo Abe and Theresa May at this stage.
An interesting connection there. Well, I think to pick up on a point Alejandra made earlier about that sort of way in which the post-war generation and the younger generation have come together and are thinking of, what a Japanese peace means and what changing the Japanese constitution will involve. to think about the fact that although, as in many other places, you see the strengthening of the right in Japan now, there is a great deal of resistance. So, but we often don't see how it pans out. So, for example, the big controversy over the history textbooks that were produced by Abe's wife somehow, I think, or she was somehow involved in that talked about Manchuria in a way that made the Japanese not responsible for anything to do with the war. The powerful teachers' union in Japan protested against this, and only 3% of schools in Japan took up that history book. So we just hear about these history books are being produced and how right-wing Japan is, and we don't hear enough about how particularly the teachers' union, which is still one of the most powerful unions in Japan, is constantly pushing against these things. Young Japanese people are pushing against it, and you have that older generation who may be reliving the '68 revolution, who are on their side. So I think the big pressure for Japan now is its relationship with the U.S., because what's happening is the Americans no longer want to be responsible for the military defense of Japan. They want to pull out as much as possible. They're encouraging the change in the Constitution. And there's also that anti-American sentiment built in. They don't want the Americans there, but if the Americans pull out, then the Constitution will have to change, and Japan may lurch more to the right. So we're back in this very conflicted area we started talking about, which is why I've edited a book called Persistently Post-War, because I don't think it's ever changed.
Well, Isolde is going to be introducing Death by Hanging, which is playing alongside a film called An Educational System of an Empire. Both those films deal with the ongoing tensions in the 1960s and ongoing tensions between Japan and Korea. And so what is that situation like at the moment?
Well, I've just come back from 7 months in Japan, and it's been very interesting actually to see the ongoing controversies. I mean, Lola's absolutely right. I mean, this idea of the Americans pushing Japan to change the Constitution's been, since virtually they wrote the Constitution within a couple of years, they rather regretted it and wanted Japan to build up its military again. And but obviously to change the Constitution, they've got to have a 2/3 majority. And in the latest round of elections, fortunately, they didn't get it, and there was a terrific protest movement against it. But what has rather struck me, because if I think back to the 1990s, the right wing was very conspicuous. They used to drive around in these huge black vans with these great microphones blasting out their various propaganda, and having lived in Sapporo, they were particularly vociferous about the various islands that they thought, the Russians had pinched from them, etc., up in the north. And they used to harangue people from these great black vans, and they were a sort of strange mixture of sort of semi-militarized types with sort of Yakuza connections, and jolly intimidating, I can tell you. Well, what was really struck me this time was most of them have gone. And I think one of the reasons for this is a lot of their ideas have now become mainstream. They're no longer necessary. And what really struck me this time, and I hadn't come across it before, is this organization called Nihon Keizai, or the Japan Conference, which, if you read on the website, virtually articulates all the things that these, black van, black-shirted, semi-military people used to espouse. And apparently, something like 60% of LDP politicians now all belong to this Nippon Keizai. And quite frankly, I find that a little bit frightening, because what I can see has happened between the 90s and now is this transition of these, what I would have classed as extreme right-wing attitudes, have now come into the mainstream, into the LDP. And it's interesting because talking to Japanese friends and colleagues, you sort of say, well, what are you going to, I mean, who do you support politically? And they said, well, we probably will vote for Abe Shinzo. And I said, well, but they said there's no alternative. And what I noticed just from watching television, and this is just the main NHK general television news and that sort of thing, when they have any issues to do with Parliament, is you've got this amazing fragmentation of all opposition now. So when you get the sort of equivalent of, you know, the Wednesday Prime Minister's Question Time, when somebody in opposition stands up to speak, they don't say, you know, so-and-so from such and such a party. They just say so-and-so from the Yato, which Yato just means the non-government. So it's terribly hard to even identify speakers and who you might agree with and perhaps support. So I've been sort of a little bit disconcerted this time in understanding how the politics works. The other thing I think that's interesting is Abe himself has sort of admitted that he wants, because his grandfather was Kishi Nobusuke, and I think this is a key point with Abe Shinzo, the current Prime Minister. Kishi Nobusuke was the Prime Minister at the time of the Ampo struggle, the defeat of the students in 1960, and he actually had to stand down. And in a sense, Abe's own mission seems to be to come in and to restore and to achieve all the things that his grandfather failed to do. And I mean, he's openly admitted this. He's written a book where he talks about the future Japan and its Utsukushi Nihon, beautiful Japan, etc., in which all these ideas, and part of that is very much building up the military. The other thing that was sort of very interesting at this time was while I was there, we had the abdication of the Heisei Emperor, and in his speeches, and indeed in his sons, the new emperor, the Reiwa Emperor, they were all talking about peace and, you know, the imperial role as being symbol of the nation, etc., etc. And in Abe's response to this, he virtually echoed that, you know, he was all for peace and all the rest. But yet within about a week, he was announcing some new battleship that was being built for the self-defense forces.
I mean, the elephant in the room is China.
And South Korea.
And South Korea, but no, North Korea.
No, South Korea.
South Korea. But
they're worried about the economics of South Korea. If South Korea is challenging Japan economically.
But also the missiles of North Korea. But I mean, but yes, China is, if the right has support in Japan from people who might not normally support the right, it is because of China. They want a strong prime minister in the face. And so but we see that everywhere. Isn't that what is supporting, you know?
Can I just pick up on a few things from before? First of all, just to talk about the international connection of avant-garde, Japanese avant-garde. One thing that strikes me, when I was watching Patriotism the other night by Mishima, I was thinking, I wonder why exactly Mishima made this film. And I was just thinking about this now. And I think a big part of it is international ambition. And Mishima desperately wanted to be the first Japanese to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. And he understood that to do that, you couldn't just be a big figure in Japan. You had to be a big figure on the world stage, and you had to therefore conquer the English-speaking world, and you had to be big in America. And in 1957, he thought that the way to do this was if he could get, he's a prolific playwright, he tried to get his modern no plays put on in New York. And he thought this would gain a great deal of attention and really push his novels. And he had an excruciating time in New York, where he was holed up in a New York hotel room for month and month and month, waiting for this production to take off. And eventually it was never actually realised, which caused him great frustration. But I think later on, when you get to the mid-60s, Mishima had he made frequent round-the-world trips and was even supposed to have scoped out Stockholm, thinking about if he could get this Nobel Prize. But I think it's very significant that Mishima premiered patriotism in France. So it's not just a question of the Japanese soaking up these influences of the new. This is really Mishima going right back to France, putting it on in France, saying, look at this, that, you know, you've never seen any, it's about copying. It's like, you've never seen anything like this before. And of course, the French really took to it. I mean, Mishima's always been very highly prized in France in particular. And I think Mishima particularly saw the potential of film to open up recognition for Japan in other fields, that his whole sort of literary canon, if he gained attention through this kind of type of avant-garde film work, it would also greatly increase the sort of literary hinterland he had. So I find that sort of international ambition that Mishima had and the way that he was using that avant-garde film work very interesting. But there's just two other quick points I'd like to make. One is, again, just that I find this question of what is avant-garde and what isn't avant-garde very interesting. But last year I was at a conference of someone who is enormously popular in the world today, who is regarded as not avant-garde at all, which is Haruki Murakami. And of course, ironically, Haruki Murakami, who's always sort of said he's not interested in Mishima, though you can tell that all his early works are written in enormous reaction to Mishima. But ironically, he's now sort of assumed the position that Mishima always wanted to get to, this internationally famous Japanese writer. But I think what's really interesting is how all these things connect. Because if you look at the progress of avant-garde film work in Japan, I think the pivotal year of it all is 1968, which the student riots, this whole expectation that there could be some type of revolution in Japan, that things can completely change, and then the collapse of all of that, and the collapse of all this belief that there's going to be a new Japan. And then what really rounds things off in absolutely shocking manner, shocking in some ways almost as much as the end of the war, is the Mishima incident, is where Mishima kills himself in such a spectacular manner. And when the announcements came over Japanese television and everyone suddenly saw Mishima's face, most people in Japan thought it was the announcement of the Nobel Prize for Mishima. And they thought, oh, he's finally won it. But this is the key moment also that all Haruki Murakami's fiction takes its starting point from. Keeps coming back and back and back to 1968, that there were these young students who had this idea of very often involved in the riots, and then afterwards are left with this kind of existential emptiness. And quite often in early Murakami, this just plays itself out and you turn yourself to indulgence of sexual excess or the body, things like that. And I think this strongly connects with a lot of the work that avant-garde film also moved into in the 1970s, once things moved on from that expectation that there was going to be some type of revolution in Japan. So I think, although we talk about Japanese avant-garde, I think it's really interesting that the avant-garde also strongly connects both to internationalism, but also to what has become some of the most enormously popular Japanese artistic contribution of the modern age. And some of the things that I think that Murakami did in the reaction to Mishima in the late 70s, which I think are regarded as sort of like kind of like commercial sellouts. Like, people tend to think that he copied American literature, he adopts an Americanized style. But if you actually understand what he's doing something actually very radical. He's saying that he starts writing to find his voice. He's thinking, you have to completely step out of Japan and Japanese altogether. you have to, and he starts like writing some of his first things in English and translating it back into Japanese and taking Japan completely out of his novels, and yet finding that there's still something intrinsically Japanese in them. And I think a lot of the experiments that the avant-garde filmmakers were making at the time, trying to get to what is the quintessence of Japan, what experiments can you make to actually get back to that, are still going on in even in the most contemporary writers and filmmakers. And just as a very final point, I'd like to say that what I find really inspiring about what was going on in the film and literary scene in the 60s and 70s was that power of individual imagination, that people weren't just slavishly following certain left or right ideologies. And that I think one of the problems we have in the world today is things have become so mindlessly polarized in so many countries to a division between whether you're pro-Trump or anti-Trump, whether you're pro-Brexit, you're anti-Brexit, whether you hate Abe or you're opposed to Abe. And I think what we really need is that kind of imaginative, personalized vision of things, that you don't just think of Japan as a right-wing agenda or as a overturning it with some sort of Marxist approach to things, that you have the actual imagination to see things and possibilities in art and in influences from the past, that you can create something distinctive that can really get to the core of what you feel your life in the world is all about.
Fabulous. And we finally got to Brexit. Right, I've got dozens more questions, but I think I've had my turn. So if there's any questions from the audience, and do we have a roving mic as well? Don't be shy.
Thank you so much for the discussion. It was really interesting. I just wanted to take it back to when you mentioned about like soft porn in the porn industry and how that related, and about how some of the young directors today, or I don't know if it's today, but have had their start in soft porn. And so I was wondering if that is a like unique transition. I don't know so much about that transition in like other countries, and so I was wondering if this is a unique part of.
I can't speak that all directors in all countries may have had their independent directors may have had their roots in soft porn. I do know that any new technology or innovation that you get in cinema is tried out in porn films first all over the world. So, but precisely because so much has moved to television in Japan, or anime films, or making films from manga, that there are these young directors who, if they want to learn how to make a film, do start in that industry. And it was particularly telling when we had the J-horror thing here in the UK, which in Japan was, you mean those movies young women like to watch? Whenever I mentioned J-horror to them, a lot of them had their start in the porn industry. So it's this kind of, where do I get the training in order to find my voice? One of the most active film industries in Japan remains that of the porn industry.
And that was certainly the case in the sort of 70s and 80s as the studios were in decline, because they weren't sort of cinema schools much. Eventually, Imamura Shohei started his film school in Yokohama precisely to fill this kind of gap. And then from the early 2000s on, the Japanese government started to encourage certain universities to set up courses. So
the only way you could learn to be a filmmaker was?
Yeah, certainly in those days, because, I mean, obviously within the studio system, you went in as an apprentice and you learned your trade that way. But once the studios were in decline, I mean, where did you learn? So you went either into direct to video V-cinema, which went straight into the video rental shops, or you did it through the softcore pornography filmmaking, because I mean that's one of the cheapest forms of filmmaking, isn't it? I mean, all you need is a room and 2 willing actors and a camera. You know, you can, very cheap budget.
Yeah, I have to say that, I mean, Ping industry also is struggling right now because clearly there were theaters who were screening Ping films, and those theaters are struggling on passing to the digital because the amount of money that they need to reconvert from screening in celluloid to screening in digital and DCP, they are forcing to close. And clearly there is another big point is internet that is taking away many of those films from theaters and going to internet. So that's also the film, the soft porn industry in Japan is changing a lot, as everywhere, I think.
So now you'll have to go to film school.
There is also television and advertising. There were a big ground for filmmakers to learn. Of course, it's difficult then to change from television to cinema, but there was, after the studio collapse, television and advertising were as well terrain to try to make films after.
Questions? Down the front? Oh, in the middle. There's a mic coming round.
It's a question for Isolde. I was interested to know, in connection to today's film as well, how you would say that the political and social situation that you described in the 60s relates to Imamura's sort of anti-Ozu style of directing. So, yeah, you know what I mean.
For me?
Yeah, it was for you.
Oh, right, okay.
Can I just quickly say, Ozu amazes me because he's a director who knows war but comes back from the war and never makes a war film. But anyway, yes, go on.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, yes. I mean, there's been a recent reappraisal of Ozu's work. I don't know if you're familiar with Yoshida Kiju's book, Ozu's Anti-Cinema. Yeah. Well, he also made a documentary film, which I think came out before the book. But anyway, that's sort of looking at Ozu in a radically new light. But yes, I mean, I think generally speaking, filmmakers from the 60s, as I say, you see, I think within Japan that there's that huge generational consciousness. And I mean, it wasn't just in filmmakers. It was this sense that the war generation went along with things. They didn't intervene to stop the war, etc. And they kind of just went along with things. So this next generation sort of, as we said, were influenced like people like Sartre and everything, which questioned the whole idea of individuality and the idea of making choices in life and political responsibility, etc. It was known as the Shutaisei debates. So in a way, you see, Ozu was kind of caught up in that generation that made films during the war and kind of cooperated in a sense. He was seen in that light. And you see people like Imamura Shohei, who was actually apprenticed to Ozu when he was studying, when he was in the studio, when he first joined, because he was at Shochiku first, and I think he was actually involved in making Tokyo Story in some of those films. So he came out of that sort of determined not to make films like Ozu. And, if you look at Pigs and Battleships and everything, compare that, say, with some of Ozu's films, it's incredibly different. But as I say, as time passes, people mellow and their ideas change. And this is where I think you've got Yoshida's book on Ozu's anti-cinema. And as Lola was saying, even, Ōshima came round to Kurosawa a certain amount. And I mean, even Ōshima in his own life, I mean, he ended up on television all the time in some of these mainstream films. So eventually he came to some sort of terms with the industry.
When you say the appraisal of Ozu, had he fallen out of...
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing. I'm getting deaf in my old age.
No, it's me. When you say reappraisal of Ozu, was there a time or when Ozu wasn't sort of revered then?
Oh, I think they were very anti-Ozu in the early days.
In Japan?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, fine.
Yeah. Oh, yes, I mean, actually,
In the West,
there's a book that Yoshida Kiju wrote under, and this was under his original name, Yoshida Yoshishige. Kiju was sort of a name he's chosen to go by subsequently. And I think it came out in 1976. In it's a collection of his essays, and it's called Visual Anarchy. And in that he recounts an incident at Shochiku just before Ozu died, and in a sort of way I think he rather regretted it, where he actually had, they both got quite drunk, and they had a pretty strong argument, a bit of a row over the whole thing, and where Yoshida actually attacked Ozu for the type of films he made, etc. But then, you see, I think it was fairly soon after that Ozu died, and then he sort of began to mellow towards him. But they were very anti him in the 60s, certainly.
Thank you.
Any other questions? At the back.
Hi, I have a question mainly for Damian. The other night you were saying in the introduction to Mishima's films that his films and films about him were largely suppressed in Japan. And so I'm wondering, as you were just saying that people like Murakami Haruki, in many ways he was very influenced by him. Are there any other writers or filmmakers who are influenced by Mishima, or like the Spirits of 68, but they won't say it, or they would announce it publicly and say, yes, this is, I love to write about death and the emperor and so on. I just wasn't sure what the situation is nowadays.
Good question. Mishima's works were, I should say, if you say why are some of the works about Mishima suppressed, part of it was his family. The John Nathan's biography of Mishima was translated into, which was 1974, was translated into Japanese, and it had to be withdrawn because objections from his family, particularly his wife Yoko, and there were other important books about him. One of his earliest gay lovers wrote memoirs, which got into trouble with the family, who did essentially anything that hinted at Mishima's homosexuality tended to be suppressed. Tended to be suppressed by the family, who pushed a line that a rather absurd line. That Mishima was completely straight man, and that all these rumours of his gayness were nonsense. At the same time, there were also concerns about the right wing. So, as I was saying before, the right wing didn't necessarily take kindly to having a sort of reimagining of the role of the emperor. And Mishima had a very complex role, complex thoughts about the emperor. He would switch to, on the one hand, he formed the Shield Society, so they would supposedly defend to the last man the emperor should there be a revolution in Japan. And he dreamt of himself being cut down in action while that happened. And yet, on the other hand, he also talked about meeting the Showa Emperor Hirohito at a garden party, and talk about how he was tempted to kill him. So if you can put those two ideas together, you're doing well. So that's part of the reason why. So there are essentially two reasons why works about Mishima have had to be handled quite carefully. Now that his wife is long deceased, I think a lot of these works that were previously suppressed have come to light more. On the subject of, I'm not aware of writers that have sort of picked up Mishima, that sort of train of ideas, and run with it. But I'm personally quite interested in the kind of creative reaction to Mishima, because I think that Mishima took he's probably the one of that generation of Japanese writers that was extremely highly educated. You probably know that for a long time, the Todai, Tokyo University, was essentially the seeding ground for all the great literary figures. And to be a big literary figure in Japan, you had to go to Todai, and you had to have this great knowledge of European literature and the classics. And I think moving into more recent years, people have tended to find that quite forbidding and oppressive. And when you've reached Murakami's reaction to that was that Mishima wrote such dense, poetic, fantastically beautiful and erudite Japanese prose that it was quite hard for a new generation of Japanese writers to reach that. And I think that's why, for example, Haruki Murakami has been so influential in Japan, is because he's the antithesis of that. He's that you don't need this incredibly dense, poetic Japanese. You can actually write in a very simple, plain style, and you can express yourself with lots of new ideas through that. So I feel that the current literary wave in Japan is a kind of anti-Mishima wave, I think, because it's people who have seen what Haruki Murakami have done and think that, well, actually, I don't need to have gone to a Todai. I don't need to have a degree in German law. I can just actually, I can be living a fairly simple life. I can be living at home, but I can sit down and I can write things in interesting ways. And I think particularly a new wave of young female writers who felt quite excluded from the system before have come to the fore. And a lot of them sort of thank someone like Haruki Murakami for opening those doors to him. So I think that Mishima still has a strong influence in the literary world, but I think it's almost like a sort of we're still in a kind of reaction to that both the extreme ending Mishima had. I mean, I was talking about the trauma of the war. I think a whole generation felt traumatized and trying to make sense of what happened to Mishima in 1970. And you might know that in Haruki Murakami's novel A Wild Sheep Chase, it actually starts on the day of the Mishima incident, and that this is what's playing on the television as the whole story unfolds. So that there's kind of in the psyche of Japan of how could that bizarre incident occur is still a sort of unresolved chapter. And one way I think people have come to terms with it is by rejecting that densely educated, striving for poetic density, and have adopted a much more loose, open literary style, which I think is still in vogue.
Just very quickly, because I know you want to turn it around. Susan Napier claims that Mishima and Miyazaki's Studio Ghibli share a lot of values in common. So if you want to bring it back to film, think about that, and I won't say anything more.
We'll leave you with, I'm afraid, the upper bulb of the hourglass is looking rather low on sand, and we must depart. However, I do ask that you fill in your feedback form. It helps JAEFF continue to exist. And I would like you to give a big round of applause to Damian, Isolde, Lola, and Alejandra.
Okay, sure.
You should sit on the chair.
Maybe here. Okay. Sorry, we've got the comfy chairs. Sorry about that. These are very comfortable.
Standing?
For me to take up. Unless I have the comfy chair and you're
Yeah. Oh, he's standing up now. Right. Yeah.
Are you?
Are you actually Australian?
Sorry?
Are you actually Australian? No. Oh.
Just lived there for a while.
Oh, right.
Thank you.
Where do you live?
We're in Sydney and Melbourne various times.
Yeah.
You've got a connection or?
Yeah, well, my wife is from
Well, I don't
that entry town thing by the time.
Should we go and get? Shall I just leave that on? Yeah.
sure because they have like Met Film School and Film London and everything. So I guess somebody must have been like really, really good at work to applying all this like, different stuff. You know, this small. You know, you have to like even like search respondents in what and what's open and what not, and apply. And
I think they're quite interesting.
yeah, it's been going for a long time. Do you maybe know
I don't
which year?
think so. No, it's maybe only in its third year or something like that. It's pretty
Okay.
young.
Yeah. But it's like a nice mixture of all old materials and also new stuff. I think they have like some new stuff.
It's weird that there isn't an actual Japanese person organising.
Yeah.
I do find that a bit strange.
Yeah.
And the two men organising it are also quite strange. Just in terms of personalities. They're nice, but they're quite weird.
Okay. Yeah, I've read what the team consisted of, and I haven't seen any Japanese.
No, and like it's slightly, I find it slightly problematic, but I don't know.
Yeah, that's true. Now you mentioned it.
Yeah.
So yeah. Well, it's translation obviously.
Yeah.
The photography. It's not.
They're African citizens, aren't they? And that's
Yeah, it's not. I mean, it's not. No. But the Japan Foundation is quite famous.
yeah.
And Japan Society. So
Yeah.
that's two like important institutions regarding that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know.
So bad? Not so bad?
It's not so bad, no? Are you here the whole afternoon?
And into the evening, yeah.
I guess somebody needs to be here or the events are on all the time.
It's maybe the problem is with the party, the bar.
Oh,
That
okay.
can really, things can go wrong.
Complicated.
Go wrong there, they really can.
Yeah. I guess.
Right, I should go down here. He's looking anxious.
Yeah?
I hate to see a person looking anxious.
Yeah.
I just give you a thumbs up. Yeah.